You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. I'm your host, Claire Pedrick, and today I'm delighted to be in conversation with Helen Kewell, author of Midlife. So listener Naomi contacted me and went, you two have to talk. So here we are. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Midlife, Stories of Crisis and Growth from the Counselling Room, also great for coaches. Before we talk about your book, tell us about you. What's the journey that got you to this midlife place?
Well, how long have you got? The journey that took me to, I guess there's two things to say on that. One is that the journey that took me to being a counsellor, which is out of the corporate world and into more of the one-to-one, interpersonal space, I suppose, which I think, like most people, came about through various life transitions, traumas, growth opportunities, as I would like to say, but drove me to think about looking at the micro rather than the macro, which is in my previous and current career of being in the realm of organization and people change at volume. And I really wanted to come down to the what happens when two people have a conversation and it changes things, down to that very small level. So that was what took me to that. And then to midlife, my specialism in my psychotherapeutic training accidentally became aging.
Oh.
So my first book, which was on the topic of living and dying well, really focused on the last decade or so of natural life, if we're privileged enough to reach that stage. And I was cross because nobody was researching it, nobody was writing about it, and yet it was just the most rewarding work I had found myself doing. And in doing so, and then approaching midlife myself in the last few years, actually realized that the aging process and the growth process actually really accelerates from mid-40s onwards as we come through all of these big life transitions, and start working out who we want to be when we grow up and the legacy we're going to leave as people. So started to research and started to work more in that space, and as is always the case, clients that I worked with just happened to be bringing that into the work I was doing. So it's this kind of wonderful moment of synchronicity, if you believe in that stuff. So
yeah. I love that you started with dying and then you're working backwards.
Yes. I think everything's about dying. I mean, then we can get onto this topic, but it is the thing that focuses us most on the meaning of life and the meaning of us and what we want to do with our time here as human beings. So yeah, I think it all starts and ends. It does all start and end there.
I agree. I'm really passionate about dying and dying well, and we're here to talk about midlife, but I'm sure there'll be some kind of crossover.
Yes.
So what have you discovered from these lovely people you've been working with?
Well, I think I discovered a couple of things, both with that. What I should say is, and I'm sure it's the case for, or I hope it's the case for all practitioners, all the work that I do with individuals changes me and vice versa. And there's this lovely liminal space where everybody's growing and changing. And so I learned a lot about myself, and I learned a lot about through that work. There's a shift in me as well. So I think it's worth saying that. I think what I learned, I mean, to summarize it, I mean, there's lots, and it's myriad, right? But the main thing, and the realization that really unlocked a lot of it for me, was that we can talk about midlife as a time of where the deficit starts in life. So we sort of, everything's just a bit less. And that some of that is just natural, because we may have, if we're lucky enough to have children, or if we've chosen to have children, we might have children leaving the nest. This is a kind of simple factor of mathematics, really. They get to a certain point and they leave. We may have friends around us who are becoming ill. We may have parents that we're caring for who may then die. We may have missed opportunities at work that we feel we won't get again. So these are kind of deficits, small deficits, which are badged as such in society and in our vernacular. And I think the biggest realization for me was realizing that each of these shocks, earthquakes, lifequakes that we experience, from that we grow. Now, I know we know that on some level, but we don't hold that truth when we're talking about the aging process. We talk about it as a sort of, and I'm doing this with my hands, you know, this sort of downward. So that's the most powerful thing I learned. And if I'm able to just, because my book focuses on midlife, and a lot of it is menopause, because for 50% of well, not 50% of people, well, 50% of the population, there is a reality that midlife is associated with menopause. And the one thing that really hooked me into this work was that you may remember there was and I can't even remember who to attribute it to, but there's a piece of research that showed that 1 million women were leaving the workforce because of the menopause. And I was curious about that because I felt like it cast middle-aged, midlife women approaching the menopause in a place of being a victim of something. And then I started to have conversations with clients and friends and myself, and I thought, does that statistic do us any good? Because what it seems to play into is, again, this deficit game of like, well, you know, there's these symptoms and you can't cope and therefore you have to leave work. Those weren't the conversations I was having. The conversations I was having were, and this was my own experience, something's changing in me and I can't quite get my fingers around it. I can't quite work out what it is. But the way I showed up before and the things I tolerated and the things I wanted to do and the things that were around me just don't fit. And I personally was filled with this really powerful rage, not that I put it anywhere in particular, but just like, no, I want to be different. I want this to be different. I want to do something different. I saw things I didn't see before, injustices maybe, and so that's the second thing I learned, that there's a sort of narrative that not everybody, in fact, nobody fits, because there can't be a generic narrative, and that's helpful for social policy and that kind of things, but it's not helpful as an individual. I think the shift that happens, particularly for women in menopause, is that you become something new, and so you then have to start thinking about what's changing around you. So it's not as simple as I just had to leave work because I was having menopausal symptoms, for example. Sorry, long answer to your question, but as you can tell, I was on one then.
Got so many things to say, ask, wonder about. I can remember when I was 30, a colleague of mine was 40, and she said, I'm loving being 40 because now people believe I can do the things that I've been doing for the last 10 years. And one of the things that I've noticed, because I'm now 62, is I said to somebody the other day, I don't care anymore. And actually, that's such a gift.
It's an unbelievable gift. And what did it unlock for you, that realization? Did anything change in the way that you operated or felt?
I think I've got nothing to lose. So I speak out in the profession because I've got nothing to lose. Because I haven't got my future career is not at risk.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't think that I am losing anything. But there's that kind of fantasy fear, isn't there? I can't do this because I've got something to lose. And, you know, the menopause thing I think is fascinating, because that was also a conversation I had just the other day with someone when I said, you know, I went through the menopause too. It wasn't spoken about like it is now. Mm-hmm. And that was only like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it wasn't a thing. I mean, it was a thing, but it wasn't the thing that is now. And so there's something for me that it's a really important life change and a transition, but there's also something that it's a bit of a marketing thing.
Oh, I 100% agree with that. And I think on that last point, there's this delicate balance of, and it's the right thing to do to raise awareness, because on a very serious note, people are really some people suffer, and some people suffer doubly because of social constructs of what public health is for, depending on where you fit within the demographics. You know, there are some really scary, and I'm not going to get into political stuff now, but there's some very scary statistics around how women's health really differs depending on who you are in society. But that's a separate topic. But so it is a reality, and the more we raise awareness, ultimately the better it is. However, I think what you're talking about, this is delicate balance, because the more we talk about it, potentially the less people listen. There is what I call the Davina factor, which is everyone's sort of slightly now, and she's done an incredible job in raising awareness, but everyone's slightly been like, okay, here's the menopause thing again, you know. So there's this delicate balance, which is why it should always come down to each of our own unique lived experiences of what's happening. But your point around was it a friend or a colleague in the 30s, when you were in your 30s?
Both friend and colleague.
Friend and colleague. I felt something similar when I became 40. When I turned 40, I was in training at the time, but I definitely wasn't. I didn't know myself very well at the time. I was in that kind of beginnings of real self-awareness, and I just did not want to be 40 at all. Didn't know. It's hilarious. I'm going to be 50 in 4 weeks' time, and I couldn't care less. Having a really big party, but the turning 40 was a real fear of mine, and I definitely remember almost the next day turning up to work and going, right, everyone has to listen to me now because I'm a grown-up. I'm a grown-up with 20 years experience or thereabouts, and there's a permissioning that happens as we age. And I think that's probably my second learning, is that by understanding how we are journeying through it and where we're at, then that you can age with intent. This is where I'm at, and that's what the coaching process and the counselling process can really unlock for people. This is who I am now, and this is how I want to show up. But something if it's okay, I just want to pick up on something you said, because I haven't thought about it before. And you jokingly said about me coming down the age brackets. Now I'm like, oh, maybe this is a thing. But maybe it's just as pressurizing and disorientating growing up in your 20s and 30s as it on the reverse as it is in your 40s, 50s and 60s and 70s, because of the maybe you don't have freedom to be yourself, because you have all the fear and the expectation of climbing whatever ladder or whatever kind of progression you're trying to find in the world. And maybe you're not as free. And that makes me sad, actually.
Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm thinking maybe as you're going up the ladder, you sometimes pretend to be older than you are, and as you're coming down, you pretend to be younger than you are.
Definitely think so. So I don't know if it comes through on the recording, but I know I can think we both have similarly grey hair, right? And this has been 3 years, about 3 years, 2 or 3 years, because I would sit in with the clients and I would say, aging is growth. How do you want to grow? Who do you want to be? And we'd have these great conversations, and then I'd run off to the hairdressers and have 4 weeks growth covered up. I used to be dark brown hair. I was growing as I was growing up, and I very, very obviously felt very uncomfortable about that as a practitioner. So I thought, oh, I'll stop doing that. And I've discovered I'm actually quite white in some places and quite grey in others. And as soon as that happened, 2 things happened for me. One, I experienced what you experienced, which is, well, I'm grown up now. I can just do what I want. Because I felt in my, I guess what I'm saying is my somatic experience of being my age was, I felt credible, credibly my age, instead of trying to pretend I wasn't. There was a sort of conflict within me, number one. And number two, less positive, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things. I'll occasionally catch myself in the mirror and think, what, the sort of lived experience of, you often hear people saying, I don't think of myself as being insert whatever age somebody is. And there is that moment, that dissonance where where it's kind of like a reminder, I don't know how you've experienced it, but it's a bit of a shock. And I suppose that is midlife. You're facing one way and facing the other, both at the same time. It's a threshold.
My experience of it is the invisible grey woman. And we came back from Spain on Saturday, and on the plane, this young woman just walked all over me and another woman. And I turned to her, and I have really experienced being invisible. And what's really odd about being invisible is that professionally, I'm not invisible at all. So I'm well known, people respect me. That's a really beautiful thing. But when I'm just out there in the world as a woman with grey hair of a certain age and wrinkles, I am invisible. In fact, if I ever write a novel, it will be called The Secret of the Silent Invisible Women.
Wow. I would definitely read that. I will be one of your secrets.
It's going to be that they're going to solve murders.
Because no one notices.
Yeah, nobody sees them at all. And I was with my husband the other day, and he's 6'2", and he's older than me, but it doesn't happen to men so much. And I was walked over, and he went, "You've always told me that, but I didn't believe you. And now I've seen it. I've seen that you're not there." So I'll walk along the pavement. There'll be 3 young people coming the other way, usually girls, and they'll walk straight into me.
There's a real physical manifestation of something that people often describe feeling, but actually gosh.
I think I'm in the privileged position of really noticing it because in my professional life it's really not there. And then in my personal life it really is there. And I think, well, I'm the same person, so that's a bit odd.
Do you react when that happens? Or do you obviously you have a reaction, but do you react outwardly?
No. I fell off the pavement one day, really hurt myself because they just didn't leave any space at all.
Incredible.
And that is a reality.
It is. And as I was talking before you brought your story, but as I was talking, I was thinking also when I said something about being grey and feeling like I could own my space more, I was thinking there's an intersection with your economic independence, right? Because I can inhabit that space because I have confidence or have more economic power than the next person. I completely recognize that is a privilege. So coming back to your point, there is also a reality in terms of career progression, jobs, for women in particular, not just for women. And I want to come on to men in a minute. I think it's really important, but because you mentioned your husband, and I thought, yes, we must talk about the men as well. But there is a really stark reality of either not having that economic power, not having access to jobs as we get older, but also, unfortunately, and particularly for women, becoming carers, and not being paid for that, and not being recognized for that, and being invisible in another way. So there is that reality as well. Yeah. Can we talk about men?
Yeah, let's talk about men.
Well, I was interested in your husband's response, but the one thing that I wanted to say is that depending on, again, it all depends on a number of things, but my experience of working with male clients in their midlife is that conversely they do feel invisible, and that is largely because of the loss of, for men in midlife generally, there's a sense of loss of power, loss of virility, and then loss of physical power, which can then internalize a sense of feeling less than and invisible, even if perhaps in the corporate layers, particularly in the senior corporate layers, they tend to be seen as wise and more important and more integral. If we leave that aside, there's a sense of, well, who am I now? I don't have, because men's typically, I think men's psychological development through life tends to be quite linear until this stage, just more of the same, increasing. And then when we get to midlife, I mean, it's the cliche, but it's the cliche for a reason. And so what I often notice is that male clients will come with something very specific that they want to work with, rather than a general feeling of malaise and I don't really know why I am in the world, and because it's very specific and it's normally physical. So that might be sexual problems with a partner, or it might be physical pain, sort of feeling low because of physical pain. And obviously that's an entry point. And then as we open out, we're in the work of who am I in the world? Who do I want to be in the world, etc. So I think it's a different dilemma, but it's still very embodied in the same way, but in a different way to women, I would say. Yeah.
I really want to ask you, what do you think, and you might not be able to answer this because it's a bit hypothetical. I just wonder what would have been different if you'd come at the midlife, but without doing the death work first.
Oh, I think it's such a good question, and I don't think I could have done. There's a general. That's the quickest way of answering that question. Let me answer that in a better way. I wrote Living Well and Dying Well when I was 41, let's say. I started the writing process when I was 40. And I definitely came to that work and the writing of it with the conceit of youth and feeling like I knew quite a lot about the world. That's what I'm going to say. And it felt like a really long way away for me, if that makes sense. I was very much I felt very empowered in the work I was doing with clients, because all of the research, certainly in psychotherapy, I haven't checked it out as much in the efficacy and coaching relationships, but certainly in psychotherapeutic relationships, the age range or the age gap is not a factor in success or failure of those relationships. The only thing is the relationship and the trust. And I never felt it to be a barrier. But I think for the writing of it, I grew immeasurably in my understanding of the world, and I grew immeasurably through my work with profoundly old clients. My first client was 95 and I was 39, I think, at the time. So I guess what I'm saying is that I was entirely changed by the work I was doing and the writing process of writing the book, of researching it, but then also living through it, and my own reflections on it immeasurably changed me. So I think that brought me a necessary humility within the aging process of my own, and understanding what it's like to then think about to think about midlife in the way that I do, or even to think about writing about it. Do you know? I needed to have that process, I would say.
Yes, to begin at the end, begin with the end in mind.
Yes, and I interviewed she's now a psychotherapist, an author called Stella Duffy, who is now a psychotherapist. She went through her own training, and she's a prolific author, playwright, and various other things. And she's an amazing lady. She's very, very straight talking, and I very much enjoyed our conversations. And I want to credit this quote to her, and I want to show you what she did when I interviewed her, because she said to me, midlife, when you're in your midlife, death comes up and says, "Hi." She did this with her hand, and I've never forgotten it. I thought, yes, the first time we really, if we're privileged enough to have not been chronically ill or had illness or disease, it's the first time our bodies go, death's that way, it's coming. I think it is one of the first times we really consider it. So I think it naturally follows. It's just that we don't necessarily acknowledge that to ourselves. It's not a language we use, but it is the first time really where we really face death as a possibility.
And yet we may be trying to restore everything back to normal, in quotes.
Yes. Oh, I want to be me again. I think the amount of people who say I'd like to feel like me again, I want to go back to feeling like me, that language, and particularly if menopause with women has taken a bit of a toll on the body. And I think it's it's important to be gentle and kind with the process of saying, because I just want to go, but who are you going to be? That's what we want to find out, and then I have to like we're gonna do that internally, put that over there and take it to supervision and then wind back and start gently edging towards what the possibility could be now. Because obviously if somebody's really, really feeling all of the symptoms of whatever that be, they're not going to want to hear me with pom-poms suggesting there might be a newly emerged brilliant version of themselves. That takes time. But I think it's there all the time, the possibility of being something new. I often say to people in there, and I say it just to get a rise, but people who I work with in their, let's say 80s, mid-80s, I'll just say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And and then we all laugh and then we come back. But it's I'm not joking. I think our growth potential is exponentially higher at this second half of life because we know ourselves so much better.
Yeah, and we have different opportunities available to us depending on our economic circumstances, don't we?
Absolutely that. Yes. Yes. So I think I was interviewed recently for an article. I'm not going to name it because it's not out yet, but the journalist who interviewed me was trying to get a quote from me to say, which is why I'm not going to name it, to say that if we're negative as we age, we become negative and people won't like us and they ignore us more. I'm paraphrasing wildly, but it was a really interesting interview because I spent the whole time moving us out of that conversation into a more expansive conversation, but it didn't fit the narrative of the article, which was you have to be positive as you're aging, otherwise, basically what I just said. And it was a really interesting exercise for me to really butt up against what I write about in terms of how social construct works. It was there in practice, if that makes sense. And I felt quite frustrated that I was kind of frustrated with myself and disappointed in myself that I couldn't, somehow get this person to see, I suppose, what I was trying to say. But it was just this forced, yes, but if we don't, if people are negative, then surely we're not meant to want to be around them. And I said, well, it's our, you can imagine how the conversation went. I'm not going to replay it, but it was a really, it was an interesting exercise for me to come to really see that up close, that sense of negativity and deficit from the press, well, from the modern construct, I guess.
Yeah, and it makes me think about other views of difference, whether it's views about race or views about gender or views about whatever. It feels like that's coming from a place of judgment.
I think judgment, and I think with aging in particular, fear.
Yeah.
There's a reason why people, I'm not suggesting there's a good reason why people would ignore you personally, but there's a reason why we make older people invisible. Yeah. Because it isn't them and us. Aging isn't them and us, it's all of us, all the time. And so it's a way of kind of boxing off and forming. I mean, it's a way of forming an understanding, but it's a way of boxing off and making safe from things we don't understand or want to see or can't access. It's kind of lazy. You often hear that. I often have that. I feel that challenge, particularly when it comes to race. It's like it's my job to understand this better, so that I'm not. I'm not saying I'm lazy, but it reflects on me if I can't cross that bridge of understanding. And in that, but it's so surprising to me that we don't do it, particularly with aging. When for those of us who are privileged enough to live into older age, it's happening to all of us.
Yeah. What an amazing conversation. What are 2 or 3 things that you've learned that you'd want listeners to hear who are coaches?
Yes, no, that's a really good question. I want, I'd say what I said earlier around holding the idea that as coaches, we exist in a world that is trying to do all of the things that I just said.
Yeah.
It's very seductive. And honestly, with the best supervision, with the best internal supervisor, with the best will, with the no amount of processing and writing, and we are still going to be pulled into those, whether we like it or not. So just remembering that means that the work is free of it. Secondly, depending on your own journey, I actually did some research on this and I should have refreshed it before I came on, but certainly I can speak for psychotherapy. The demographic has a distinct bell curve in the middle age bracket. So most practitioners are going to be approaching their midlife transition or through it, and well into aging well, let's say. So all of our stuff is in the room as well. And I would say that is both a blessing and a curse. So know what's yours. As I said earlier, when I was talking about my pom-poms, that's all mine, right? Or it's partially mine. It's partially mine, and it's partially my hope for my clients, but it is, mostly mine. So know that that's in the room. Work back from it, but also use it. My midlife transition brought anxiety. I didn't know until that point that I had never felt anxiety. And I am so privileged to have not known anxiety until I was in my early 40s. I know that now. I thought I was anxious. Then I felt it and I was like, this is alien. And I do think that that's a touchstone for me for understanding when the clients I'm working with bring something, it's not the same. Of course it's not, but it helps me to as a frame of reference. So knowing what's yours, being able to pull that to one side, but also use it in service of client work would be number 2. And number 3 is I would wish that everybody held the idea, and I think we probably all do. I can only imagine that all coaches would feel this way, that all transition is growth. And we have to, certainly in psychotherapy, we have to hold clients in their pain and in their loss. And of course we do hold that space, but we also hold hope, and transition is growth. And so we can hold the idea that through this and out of this, there's more. And if we hold that, then something will change and shift. And so can I have 4?
Yes, of course you can.
Because one just came to me. The other one is so my training is rooted in existentialism. So I'm an existentially informed humanistic counselor, my full title. But what that means is I love philosophy, but it's mostly, and that's why death features a lot in the work I do. But the underpinnings of that is that if we can come back to meaning and to purpose and our place in the world, that can anchor us. And I do think that the midlife transition can be very disorientating. So much is changing, and almost imperceptibly until we're in crisis, and then we're not really sure what happens. It's the sort of boiling frog thing where you're suddenly in crisis and you're not really sure how you got there. So helping clients to locate the meaning of that for them, again, not straight away, not like, oh, I hear you're, not that, but just what's in this for you, what might be in this for you, and what do they feel about their place in the world now? And that's ground. I find that can be quite grounding at a time when everything's swirling a bit, and quite helpful. So there we are, there's 4.
Thank you. And there's something, isn't there, that midlife is normal. It happens for all of us in the same way that dying is normal and happens for all of us.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And to name it. Because actually, if you haven't asked me this question, but now I'm reflecting on it. If I think about the clients that I work with who are in their midlife years, I don't think a single one came in and said they wanted to talk about their midlife transition. It was clients who've been with me for quite a long time who suddenly had a newfound anxiety that they didn't have before, or fears they didn't have before, or relationships that had changed. And after a while, and one in particular who's in her early 40s and was suddenly noticing that although she'd chosen not to have children and indeed did not want to have children, was finding all of this sort of biology coming up that was so it doesn't come with a fanfare and a flag, is what I'm saying. So naming it in the way you just did and saying, well, this may be what's happening, can be really powerful, and then naming and normalizing, I suppose, those two things.
Well, thank you. I feel we should be drinking a glass of wine with Naomi Ward.
I mean, I think if you and Naomi and I ever got on one of these together, I think we'd have to do a long form.
I think we would. I think you're right.
Fine.
So, Helen, your book's Midlife, Stories of Crisis and Growth from the Counselling Room by Helen Kewell. I'll put the link in the show notes.
Thank you.
How do people get in touch with you if they want to follow that up?
Probably the easiest and quickest way is to find me on LinkedIn. So it's just my first name, surname on LinkedIn. Yes, and I'm on there a lot, so that's the easiest way.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much. It's been so good to talk to you.
And you. So thank you, Helen Kewell, for coming to the Coaching In, and thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching In, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching In, 3D Coaching's virtual hub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.